The night Josephine Fraser was put out of Crestmore, the snow had not yet decided what it meant to do. It hung in the air, more cold than fall, catching the lantern light at the servants' entrance, as though each flake were considering its options. She stood at the bottom of the stone steps with 18 weeks of secret pressed beneath her apron and a cloth bag that held everything she owned, and Lady Dorothea Ashworth watched from the doorway above with the composed expression of a woman correcting an error in household accounts. Not cruel. Certain. The kind of certainty that does not require raised voices, because it has never been seriously contradicted. "You have been given a week's wages," Lady Dorothea said. "That is more than the situation warrants." Josephine did not answer. There was nothing to say to certainty that would not simply confirm it in its own estimation. She picked up her bag, turned her face toward the long drive, and began to walk the 4 miles to the village of Ashgate in the settling dark. What she did not yet know was that Edmund Ashworth, Duke of Crestmore, was at that hour riding the North Road back toward his estate after 6 weeks in London, and that by the time his horse turned through the stone gates, the footman who met him would have a story prepared, careful and complete, about a maid who had left without notice, owing to circumstances that were, Lady Dorothea would explain the next morning, entirely of the girl's own making. Josephine had come to Crestmore in the spring, the daughter of a village schoolmaster who had died in February, leaving debts, and an inventory of books that could not feed anyone. She had taken the position because Agnes, the old housekeeper who had known her father, had written to say there was a vacancy in the upstairs cleaning staff and that it paid £14 a year. £14 a year was the distance between a roof and none. Josephine had accepted by return post and arrived on a Tuesday with clean hands and the habit of reading anything that was left within reach. She was 22 years old, which was not young in the eyes of the marriage market, and she was educated in a way the household did not know what to do with, which she had learned quickly to keep to herself. She dusted the shelves of the library without reading the spines aloud, though every title registered in her mind like a small greeting. She carried coal scuttles and hot water and trays of breakfast things without complaint, because complaint was a luxury that required a position from which one could afford to fall, and she had no such position. Agnes watched over her with the close, particular attention of an old woman who has seen enough harm done to careful young ones to know when to stand nearby. She was 63, plain-spoken, with hands that had opened and closed around the routines of Crestmore for 31 years, and would not easily open around anything else. She brought Josephine her supper on the nights Josephine's knees ached from the stone floors, and she never mentioned the books Josephine kept under her narrow mattress. The household's rhythms were shaped almost entirely by Lady Dorothea, who administered the estate with the focused governance of a woman who had never been asked to relinquish it and did not intend to begin. Edmund was in London more than he was at Crestmore, his returns unpredictable, his manner on those returns formal and carefully distant in the way of a man who has learned that warmth is a liability. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with a face that gave nothing away in company, and gave even less to himself in private. The servants called him fair. Agnes called him solitary. He had been married once. His wife, Catherine, had died 2 years prior, and on the morning after her death, a letter had been found among her things that established she had been conducting a correspondence of considerable intimacy with Edmund's closest friend for the better part of their marriage. Edmund had dismissed the friend without explanation, turned Catherine's portrait to face the wall in the gallery, and thereafter conducted himself with a discipline so complete it had come to resemble a kind of permanent weather. He noticed Josephine for the first time in late summer, 3 months into her employment. when she was carrying a breakfast tray up the east stair, and he was descending, and their routes converged at the landing. She stepped aside immediately, as was correct. He paused, which was not. He looked at her with an attention that lasted perhaps 4 seconds longer than rank required, and then he continued down the stairs without a word, and Josephine remained at the landing until she heard the front door close and let out the breath she had been holding since the landing's 3rd step. She had not known what to make of it. She had decided, in the orderly way she decided most things, to make nothing of it at all. The single night of candlelit honesty between them had come in October, 2 months before her dismissal, when a fire in the back passage had driven her out of her room at 11:30 and into the library for warmth, while Agnes directed 2 footmen with buckets. Edmund had been there already, reading by the fire, and had looked up with the expression of a man who had expected no one, and found, on some unacknowledged register, that no one was not what he wanted. They had talked for 2 hours. She was not certain afterward precisely how it had happened, only that he had asked her a question about the book in her hand, and she had answered honestly, forgetting for a moment that she was not supposed to have opinions aloud, and he had listened with the focused stillness of a man who had not recently been told something true. He asked another question. She answered that one too. By the end of the 2nd hour, the fire had burned lower, and the space between them on the 2 facing chairs had narrowed in increments neither of them had announced, and what passed between them was not reckless and not cold, but the specific quiet thing that happens when 2 people recognize each other across a distance that should have made recognition impossible. She had not expected it. She did not regret it. She understood, with perfect clarity, that she was not the kind of woman the Duke of Crestmore would acknowledge in daylight, and she had accepted that understanding the way she accepted the £14 a year, as the true shape of a world she had not designed. She had been wrong about the acknowledgement, though not in the direction she had hoped. In the 4 miles between Crestmore's gates and the village of Ashgate, the snow made up its mind and fell properly. She arrived at the inn with wet shoes and the particular cold that settles inside a person rather than on them. She had 9 shillings of the week's wages already spent in her mind. 3 nights at the inn, enough food to think clearly, and then a decision that she would make when she was warm enough to make it. The child she had known for 6 weeks. She had told no one. She had been deciding how and when, and whether Edmund could or should be informed, turning the problem over each morning like a stone she could not set down. Lady Dorothea had discovered the condition not through any confession, but through the laundress who had noticed what the sheets confirmed, and had acted the same afternoon with the quiet efficiency of a woman removing an error before it could be seen by anyone whose opinion mattered. Agnes had come to Josephine's room while she was packing, and stood in the doorway and said, with a flatness that was the closest she came to fury, "I will write to him." "Do not," Josephine said. "He would not thank you for the information, and I will not be the cause of further difficulty." Agnes had taken her hands instead, which was not a thing Agnes did lightly, and had held them for a moment before stepping back. "You are the finest person in this house," she said. "That is not nothing, even if it currently produces nothing." She wrote the letter anyway. Josephine, who did not know this, spent her first nights in Ashgate calculating 9 shillings with the precision of someone who understands that precision is the only luxury still available to her. If you have stayed this far with Josephine's story, it is worth your leaving a word in the comments, because her particular kind of quiet endurance is the thing this channel was made to honor. The village of Ashgate was small and cold, and possessed of the low, communal attention that small, cold villages always possess, where everyone's circumstances were everyone else's concern, and a young woman alone at the inn in November was a circumstance that required accounting for. Josephine gave her name as Miss Fraser, declined to give more, and found in 3 days that she needed more than an inn room if the 9 shillings were to last until she could arrange something permanent. She found a room above a draper's shop on the main street, 2 shillings a week, with a window that faced north and a stove that required considerable coaxing. She mended for the draper's wife in exchange for extra coal. She taught letters to the draper's youngest daughter in exchange for supper on Tuesdays and Fridays. It was the teaching that Edmund saw. He had ridden through Ashgate on the 2nd day of December, not because his errands required it, but because the north road was rutted and the village street was better ground, and because he had been riding longer and further than his affairs warranted for 3 weeks, and he had not examined why. The story Lady Dorothea had told him sat in his chest like a stone he could not locate precisely enough to remove. A maid who had left without notice, without farewell to anyone, without reference, because of circumstances entirely of her own making. He had accepted the explanation. He had told himself he accepted it. He did not accept it. Through the draper's front window, unlit against the gray afternoon because Josephine was conserving the lamp, he saw her at a low table with the draper's daughter, a child of perhaps 6 years old, and Josephine's hand was guiding the girl's finger across a page. And she was reading aloud in a voice he could not hear through the glass but could observe in the precise shape of her mouth. The way a music teacher at a conservatory shapes notes for a student. Patient and particular, and entirely without the self-consciousness of someone who knows they are being watched. He sat on his horse for 3 minutes. He knew it was 3 minutes, because he counted the church clock striking the quarter hour, and knew where it had stood when he arrived at the window. He had no practical reason to stop. He stopped. The bell above the draper's door announced him. The girl scrambled back. Josephine looked up and went very still, with the specific quality of stillness that belongs to someone who has spent considerable effort not expecting a thing and is now confronted with it directly. "Miss Fraser," he said. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was level. Her hands, flat on the table, were not. He bought 3 yards of dark wool from the draper's wife, who materialized from the back room with the alert attention of a woman who recognized a duke when one appeared in her shop. He could not have said later why he had bought the wool, except that he needed a reason to remain standing in the room for the time it took him to understand that Josephine was thinner than she had been at Crestmore, and that the room above was where she was living, and that neither of these things was consistent with a woman who had left of her own free will. He left without asking what he needed to ask. He rode 2 miles back toward Crestmore, turned the horse, and rode back. And she was at the window when he returned, the draper's daughter gone, the lamp now lit because the afternoon had failed entirely. He knocked on the side door, and she opened it, and they stood in the narrow passage between the shop and the stair, with the snow audible on the roof, and the stove making its small, effortful sounds above them. "You did not leave willingly," he said. "Not a question." "I was given a week's wages," she said. "That is not the same thing." He looked at her with the same quality of attention he had given her on the landing in summer, the kind that lasted longer than rank required, and she looked back at him without deflection, because there was no longer any point. "Come back to Crestmore," he said. "Under what arrangement?" she said. The question was not hostile. It was the honest question of a woman who has learned that the terms of arrangements determine whether they are survivable, and she was owed an honest answer. "I do not yet know," he said. But not as a maid. She did not tell him about the child that night. She understood that she should, and she understood equally that she could not, because she was not certain what he was offering, and she would not use the child as the mechanism by which she secured it. If he was to choose her, he would choose her from what he knew, and not from what she had made necessary. She gave him no answer that night. He rode back to Crestmore with the 3 yards of dark wool across his saddle, and the understanding that his mother had lied to him sitting in his chest where the stone had been. And those 2 things were not separate. The conversation with Lady Dorothea came the following morning, in the yellow drawing room, with the fire laid and the tea things set, and every material comfort of Crestmore arranged in its proper place, which was the setting in which Lady Dorothea preferred to deliver conclusions. "The girl left of her own choice," she said, with the smooth patience of a woman who has told a story enough times to have ceased distinguishing it from fact. "I spoke with her yesterday," Edmund said, a brief pause, no longer than a breath. "Then I expect you found her quite comfortable," Lady Dorothea said, "and perfectly resigned to her situation." "She was neither," he said. Edmund. His mother set down her cup. "Clara Vane arrives on the 19th. Her family has been patient. Her position is correct in every particular. I would ask you to consider what you are doing before you do it, and to consider what Crestmore requires of its next Duchess." He was silent for long enough that Lady Dorothea took it for agreement. It was not agreement. It was the particular silence of a man who has decided something and is measuring the distance between where he stands and what the decision will cost. It was Agnes who came to him 2 days later, in the library where he was standing at the window that faced north, in the posture of a man trying to see something he is not yet sure is there. She knocked, entered without waiting for his answer, which was not usual, and placed a folded letter on the desk behind him. "I wrote to you 5 weeks ago," she said. "Lady Dorothea returned it to me without explanation. I kept it. I am giving it to you now because Miss Fraser told me not to, and she is nearly always right. But not this time." He turned from the window. Agnes said, "Read it, Your Grace. Then decide what you are." He read it. The letter was 6 sentences. It told him that Josephine was expecting his child, that she had not reported this to Lady Dorothea, and had not intended to inform him under conditions of constraint, and that Agnes had decided, against all instruction, that he deserved to know what he had fathered. 6 sentences, plainly written. Nothing asked, and nothing demanded. He stood at the desk for a long time with Agnes still in the room, which was unusual, and she did not move to leave, which was also unusual. And neither of them spoke for the better part of a minute. Then he said quietly, "She did not tell me herself." "No," Agnes said, "because she did not want me to feel compelled." "Yes," Agnes said. "That is Josephine precisely." He left for Ashgate within the hour. The gallery passed him in the corridor as he walked to the stables, and through the open doorway he could see the turned portrait of Catherine facing the wall, the gilt frame visible, the canvas itself averted, and he paused at the doorway for the first time in 2 years, and looked at it without the flat, cold avoidance he had maintained since the morning he had turned it, and he felt, quite clearly, and without any particular drama, that the wall it faced was his, and not hers, and that what Catherine had done had shaped the inside of him into a shape that was not his own, and that he was tired of living inside it. He walked to Ashgate. He did not take the horse. He needed the cold and the miles, and the particular clarity that comes to a man who puts himself into weather deliberately, and then has nothing to do but think. He found Josephine at the stove, which had won the evening's negotiation. She was standing with her back to him when he knocked, and she turned and he saw her fully in the lamplight for the first time in weeks, and the child was visible now, the first rounding of her beneath her gown, and she watched his face with the careful composure of a woman waiting to learn what her world is. "I know," he said. "Agnes wrote to me in November. My mother returned the letter. I read it this morning." Her face did not change. Then it changed. The composure did not fail, but something beneath it loosened, very slightly, the way a held breath loosens when the room is safe enough to release. "I was going to tell you," she said. "When I knew what I was telling you into, you told Agnes not to send it again. I did not want you compelled." "I know," he said. "That is the part that has occupied me for the last 4 miles." He stood in the cold passage, and she stood by the warm stove, and he said, "Josephine, will you marry me?" Not a proposal shaped by grandeur or ceremony, a question. Direct, level, from a man who had spent 2 years behind a discipline that had served him well and was now serving him nothing. She was silent for a moment. Not from doubt, but from the careful work of locating the true answer inside all the answers that would have been easier. "Are you asking me because of the child?" she said. "I am asking you because of October," he said. "The child makes it urgent. It does not make it false." She looked at him with the full precision of her intelligence, which she had spent the better part of a year suppressing in contexts that punished it. And what she found in his face was what she had found by the fire in October, which was honesty, and which she had decided at the time she could not afford to believe in. She had been wrong about that too. "Yes," she said. They were married on the 16th of December, quietly, at the village church in Ashgate, with Agnes and the vicar's wife as witnesses, and the snow falling in the serious way it had. Having now fully committed to the season, Mr. Holt, the solicitor, arrived from Crestmore 2 hours after the ceremony, with the documents that confirmed the marriage was formally recorded and that any child born of it was legitimate under the laws of England in the year 1814. He was a small, correct man who had served Crestmore for 11 years and who performed his function without comment and departed before the ink was entirely dry. Josephine had refused to go to Crestmore until after the ceremony. Edmund had not argued. She understood the reasons better than she could say, and she thought he understood them too, which was one of the things about him that was specific and not general, and not transferable to any other man she had known. Lady Dorothea did not know of the marriage when Clara Vane arrived on the 19th. She did not know of it when the winter ball was arranged for the 22nd, a gathering of 14 families of the county, and every consequence that Crestmore's society entailed. She had constructed the evening as the formal announcement of the engagement between Edmund and Clara, and she had constructed it with the focused competence she brought to all things. And it was, in every material particular, exactly what she intended it to be. Edmund permitted the arrangements to proceed, not because he was uncertain, but because a thing done privately in the solicitor's office lacks the specific finality of a thing witnessed by the people whose witness produced the original harm. He had learned this from the manner in which Catherine's betrayal had been concealed, how a private wrong can be carried for years in the body, how it gains weight in proportion to how few people know of it, and he had decided he would not carry this particular thing privately. Josephine had been settled in the East Wing since the 17th, under Agnes's care, quiet and growing, and reading the books in the library that she now had every right to read, which was a right she had not yet entirely accustomed herself to. She moved through the rooms of Crestmore with the careful attention of a woman who knows her own worth and is still learning to believe the world has agreed. The night of the ball, she wore gray silk that Agnes had found in a trunk in the East Passage, let out at the waist and retrimmed at the neck with a narrow band of darker ribbon, plain against the diamonds and trained gowns of the assembled company. She was 22 years old and nearly 7 months along, and she stood in the doorway of the Crestmore ballroom and understood that what was about to happen would happen in front of all of them. And she steadied herself the way she always steadied herself, which was from the inside out. The specific bones first, and then the rest. Clara Vane was exactly what Josephine had understood her to be from Agnes's description. 20 years old, dark-haired, dressed in white satin and sapphire drops, arranged at Lady Dorothea's side with the composed certainty of a woman who has been told her entire life that she is the correct answer to every relevant question. She was not unkind. She was simply sure in the way of someone whose surety has never been examined, and she had spent 3 days at Crestmore already convinced that Edmund's distance was a species of masculine formality that would resolve upon engagement. Lady Dorothea had not looked at Josephine when she entered the ballroom. She had looked very briefly at Agnes, who stood 2 paces behind Josephine, and her expression had contracted for a single moment into something that might have been calculation, and then smoothed itself back into the composed authority she wore the way some women wear pearls. A provincial miss, a woman named Mrs. Perry said to her companion near the east wall, in the stage whisper that drawing rooms use when they want to be heard by the correct people. In grey, in Edmund's ballroom. Edmund heard it. He was at the far end of the room, speaking with Lord Alderton about nothing that mattered, and when he heard Mrs. Perry's voice, he did not visibly react, but Lord Alderton, who had known Edmund Ashworth for 20 years, noticed that his jaw set in a way it rarely did in company. Lady Dorothea moved to the center of the room at 9:30, which was the arranged signal for the gathering to consolidate toward the fireplace end. She stood beside Edmund with the erect composure of a woman about to place the final piece of a design she has been constructing all season, and Clara Vane took her place on Edmund's other side with the small composed smile of a woman arriving at the moment she had been promised. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lady Dorothea began, her voice carrying the room without effort, the voice of a woman who has never had to raise it to be heard. "I am grateful for your company at Crestmore this evening, and it is my particular happiness to announce," Edmund said. "A moment, Mother." Not loud, not sharp, the kind of quiet that a room hears anyway, because it comes from someone who has never required volume to produce attention. Lady Dorothea stopped. The room did not so much fall silent as reassemble itself in the direction of Edmund. The way rooms do when something unexpected enters them, and they are not yet certain what to make of it. He turned and looked across the ballroom to where Josephine stood near the doorway, and he crossed to her in 12 unhurried strides, with 14 families and their assembled opinions watching, and he offered her his hand. She looked at the hand. She looked at his face. She took it. He turned back to the room with Josephine's hand in his, and the silk of her gray gown beside the dark cloth of his coat, and he said, in the same measured quiet, "I should like to introduce my wife, Josephine Ashworth, Duchess of Crestmore. We were married 6 days ago in Ashgate, before this company was assembled, because I wish to present the fact rather than the intention. Mr. Holt has the documents." A pause followed that contained a great many things. Lady Dorothea's face did not change for 2 full seconds. Then, in the space beneath her composure, something shifted, something that she could not recover into authority in time to prevent the room from seeing it. And what the room saw was not rage and not tears, but the specific expression of a woman whose certainty has met something it was not built to accommodate, and she sat down, which she had not intended to do. "She is with child," Lady Dorothea said, and it came out quieter than she had meant, without the authority she had meant to carry it with. "Yes," Edmund said, "the Ashworth heir, which is why the matter was urgent." Clara Vane, to her credit, looked at Josephine, and then at Edmund, and then, with a composure that was not theatrical but genuine, she dipped her chin a single time and said nothing. She understood. She was not pleased. She left the room with her mother 15 minutes later, and she did not look back. And she was not cruel about any of it, because she was not, at base, a cruel person, only a person who had been certain and was now not, and who had the dignity to carry that with less noise than the situation invited. Mrs. Perry said nothing more about gray gowns. Lord Alderton touched his glass to his neighbors and said under his breath, "Well then," which was his highest expression of approval. The room accommodated the fact, the way rooms always accommodate facts that are presented with sufficient authority. Slowly, audibly, and then all at once. Agnes, in the doorway, who had been present for 29 of Crestmore's most significant moments, allowed herself to press one hand briefly against her mouth. Mr. Holt, summoned from the adjoining room, confirmed the record with the quiet exactitude for which he had been employed for 11 years. And then he withdrew, and was not needed again. Josephine stood beside Edmund with her hand still in his, and felt the room redistribute itself around the new fact of her, the whispers realigning from dismissal to accommodation, the faces turning with the slow curiosity of people encountering something they had not been prepared for and were now deciding how to regard. She did not smile with triumph. She was not built for triumph. She looked at the fire in the great hearth at the far end of the Crestmore ballroom, burning orange and gold and very steady, and she felt the child move, a small, distinct motion, private and irrefutable, the first time she had felt it clearly enough to be certain. She pressed Edmund's hand once, very slightly. He pressed back without looking at her, still facing the room, and she understood that this, too, was a kind of honesty, the small private thing held inside the public moment, the same quality she had recognized by the fire in October and had not allowed herself to trust until now. Later that evening, when the company had thinned and the candles had burned to their second third, Edmund took her to the gallery. He did not explain where they were going. He simply turned down the corridor that led to the long room where the family portraits faced the walls that they had always faced, or the walls he had turned them toward, and stopped before the portrait of Catherine. He looked at it for a moment. The gilt frame, the turned canvas, the deliberate avoidance of 2 years. Then he turned it to face the room, not because he forgave what could not quite be forgiven, but because a portrait turned from the world is a kind of wound that has sealed without healing, and he was done carrying the shape of it. Catherine had been what she had been. He had been what he had been in those years. The portrait was paint and canvas, and the gallery needed to be a room he could walk through. He looked at Josephine, and she looked at the portrait, and she said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. And they walked back through the gallery together to the firelit drawing room where the last of the fire was working very hard. And Agnes had left a tray with 2 cups on the side table, because Agnes never missed what a room needed. The child was born on the 3rd of February, a boy, delivered with Agnes in attendance, and a London physician summoned 3 days in advance, because Edmund had arranged the physician 3 days in advance, which was the specific manner in which he expressed a concern he could not yet put into words. The delivery was long, and then it was over, and Josephine lay with the child in her arms in the room that was now fully and irrevocably hers, the snow at the window doing what it had done since December, patient and thorough, and without any regard for the anxieties below. They named him William. Edmund came in when the physician had departed and stood at the bedside and looked at his son with the expression of a man who has spent 2 years managing himself against vulnerability and finds himself entirely outnumbered. Josephine watched him look at the child, and she thought, with the clarity she had when she was tired enough to stop managing her own observations, that he was exactly what she had seen by the fire in October, which was a person doing his genuine best inside a world he had not designed and could not entirely correct, and that she had been right to trust it. She held William out toward him. He took his son with the careful precision of a man who has never held something so new, and is learning the weight of it. Agnes, in the doorway, wept, which she would have denied if asked. The fire burned. The snow fell outside the windows of Crestmore's east wing, 4 miles from the village of Ashgate, and the draper's shop, and the north-facing room where Josephine had kept her books under a mattress and taught letters to a small girl by lamplight, and waited to understand what kind of woman she was allowed to become. She had been 22 in the spring, and she was 22 now, holding her son's small fist around her finger in the warmth of the room that was hers. And the answer was in the room's own air, in the fire and the snow and Agnes in the doorway and Edmund beside her with William against his chest. And the answer was this: she was the kind of woman the world had decided not to see, and had been seen anyway, by someone whose seeing made it permanent. William's fist tightened slightly around her finger, and she looked at his face, which was its own country, and entirely new. And she did not look away. If Josephine's story moved you tonight, leave the word William in the comments, and this channel will know that you were here.